A very good morning to you, or is it afternoon? Yes, it's afternoon. Thank you very much for making time to come and be part of this very important panel this afternoon, where we'll be discussing very key issues, and in this case, agriculture. As you heard, my name is KASUJJA from the BBC. I present a program called Newsday, and we basically talk about the biggest stories in the world and make sure that Africa is covered as much as we possibly can, and also make sure that African stories are contextualized in a much more global context. Now, usually when you come to do panels like this, you're given a whole write-up on what you should be talking about. But today I decided to rip my script and just have a candid conversation with my panel today, because this is a conversation that I feel very passionate about as an African, but also importantly, as someone who sometimes gets frustrated with the way things are running on the continent. I'd like to introduce you to my very distinguished panel, starting, of course, on my immediate left with Frank BRAEKEN. He spent 25 years with Unilever. He's currently the Chief Investment Officer of Amatheon Agri Holding, which is based in Germany. And he's also worked in China, and a lot of his discussions will be drawing examples from China. Let's give him a round of applause, if we may. And sitting next to him is the Honorable Nelson MESSONE, who is the Minister for Forests, Environment and the Protection of Natural Resources in the Gabonese Republic, our distinguished hosts today. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'd also like to introduce you to Moussa, SECK, who is the Chairman of the Pan-African Agribusiness and Agro-Industry Consortium that is headquartered in Kenya, but you are based in Dakar. Is that correct? Yeah, let me start off by talking to you. And my question to you is, 50 years after most African countries became independent, why are we still having a discussion about the importance of agriculture? Mr. SECK, why haven't we sorted out agriculture? Why are we still sitting here in Gabon discussing it 50 years after most African countries became independent?
I think that your question is really important. And in fact, it is the question that all Africans are wondering about. Because today there's 1 billion Africans, and we're only producing 500 million tons of food, whereas we need 1 ton per person per year. So we have a deficit, about 50% level of deficit. And so why hasn't this been developed? In other words, a real transformation of food in Africa and agriculture in Africa. I think that we have to have a realization on the part of the importance of agriculture in Africa, because agriculture is not just isolated. The primary role of agriculture is not just the only aspect, that we've got to somehow free up the time and to be able to have everything that is necessary, required for agricultural development.
That majority of the population can then be freed up to do other things. The whole population can be planting food for eating.
Yes, absolutely. Before, when we had food gathering and just hunting, in other words, everyone in the tribe were out there getting food. And then from one day to the other, when we started to have the production put into the granary, then he was thinking, what can I do with the extra time that I have now? And what am I going to do with the time? And so, in other words, this was the role. This very important aspect is to free up the time for people to carry out agriculture. So 70% of the African population are living in the rural regions. And so agriculture, in order to be able to feed the population, we don't need 100% of the population. We actually need less than 10% of the population. And so we've got to free up those other people to do other things. And then somehow,
where you have majority of the people involved in it, does not make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't make sense, absolutely. In other words, most of the industrialized countries that are developed, they have mastered the agricultural development, and they've only got 95% of the population is not in agriculture. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It means that with technology, with all the different strategies we can apply, we can deal with a very small percentage of the population. But of course, we've got to somehow go even further than giving it a priority. We've got to make it a conditional upon which Africa cannot develop.
That African governments are trying to prioritize agriculture as a sector is flawed, that it should actually be a condition from, am I getting that right, rather than a priority? What are you saying exactly?
Yes, because all the different African countries are always going to say that it's a priority. But it's never really a priority. If you look at all the economies and look at the different budgets that are given to agricultural development, we can see that it is a very small percentage, including the health budget. If you go to, for instance, see the ministers and the government, and you'll see that it's at the 15th rank in these different countries. And if you want to invest in agriculture, you're going to have a lot more money that's going to be invested even in languages. And so when you start looking at how many students are going to be studying agriculture, there's nobody studying agriculture. Nobody is being motivated.
To come to the Honorable Minister MESSONE in a few moments to get a sense of how the Gabonese Republic is dealing with this issue. But let me bring Frank in. Frank, you spent a lot of time in China. Talk to me about how the Chinese have actually done it. How have they managed to make sure that their population benefits from agriculture as much as possible?
I think if I can link it to your first question, let's be clear, this is not a debate of 50 years. I mean, we are 70 years further after independence, but if you really look at it, I think the real debate about agriculture in Africa is one of the last 3 to 4 years, really, when you would have this kind of discussion. And of course, one of the reasons is that from a political perspective, the urban population and the urban middle class was politically much more relevant than agriculture. Now, what happened, and I think that's where China has already started playing an important role, that as of the 80s, 90s, and later, the whole world was watching how the Green Revolution in Asia, but in China in particular, was lifting massive amount of people out of poverty. Whereas in the 80s, there was 30% poverty rate in China, it's now around 3%. And the whole agricultural policy is, of course, a key building block of that poverty alleviation. So it became quite apparent for everybody that you cannot talk about Africa development without talking about agriculture. And that is, I think, where this debate became really center stage rather than an economic debate.
Now, based on what Mr. SECK said, should we be trying to get people out of agriculture into other sectors? Is that something that would help? Because he says that it doesn't make sense to have majority of the population working on agriculture.
I don't think that the answer is black or white. It's, of course, if you look at China as an example, there's still 200 million Chinese in agriculture, with an average hectarage of less than 1. But what you do see, of course, that there has been a massive migration as well at the same time. And I think in Africa, it's really and. We have to see a situation in which smallholder farmers really become part of an economic value chain and become farm firms or commercial farmers. But at the same time, that will also imply that some of them will actually move down the value chain themselves in terms of employment and become truck drivers and become entrepreneurs and become mechanics. So that is the reason why focusing on agriculture actually gives a multiplier effect in terms of economic development. That's the other thing that China has shown. If your agricultural sector grows faster than your overall economy, poverty alleviation goes faster.
Let me now come to the Republic, or to the Gabonese Republic. And by the way, thank you very much to the people of Gabon for giving us such a warm welcome. I've enjoyed my stay. I've been here for the last few hours, and thank you very much. Let me come to you, Mr. Minister. You have an interesting challenge on your hands. Your country is 80% forest. So how do you transform that potential into a dividend? How do you then take advantage of vast amounts of land and then mold that into what might turn out to be the one country that feeds most of the countries in the region?
This is a very important question that goes to the heart of our development policy, the way it goes now. La plupart des...
And most of the personalities who took the floor since the beginning of this forum have actually put the emphasis on the right vision. I believe the president of the Gabonese Republic articulated this vision in 3 different visions. The Green Gabon was one of them. And Green Gabon is obviously a pillar that rests on the need to develop as synergetically and consistently as possible and in a complementary way, both the agricultural sector, obviously, the forest industry, as well as other parallel sectors that are all intertwined, obviously, with this huge green land that you alluded to later on, and that covers up most of the superficie in Gabon. So, forest industry, obviously, is one of the greatest assets in Gabon. It represents even more than 80%, 88% more exactly, of our territory. But this should not hurry us into a number of careless decisions at the expense of mercantilization of those forests, for example, or certain arable lands, as was the case in a number of other countries, which may have detrimental effects on our economic development in the long run, because there might be access problems for the local populations in the most isolated regions, and so on. So basically, in the course of our agricultural development, we've got to start from the development or the exploitation of those forest cultures, and we have an interesting model, to quote as an example, that developed alongside with the food industry, the olam industry, with which the government entered a dialogue in order to, first of all, allocate part of the lands that were to be exploited in the context of this activity, but also with the social dialogue with the local populations to make sure that nobody felt expelled or exploited by these operations, basically. But I think Gabon certainly also endorses a responsible approach, because our forests are not only necessary for the agricultural sector, but also for the planet's balance. The Gabonese forests belong to the Congo Valley, basically, which is one of the lungs of this planet. And so if we embark upon an agricultural development that doesn't make allowance for these ecological services that we have to provide to the rest of the planet, then we're also heading for a deadlock, basically. So this whole dimension of sustainability, the environmental and the social factors need to be integrated into our equation in our exploitation system, basically. So this is basically to summarize what I believe characterizes the process or the general direction that we wish to give ourselves in the agricultural development of Gabon. Of course, there are a whole set of programs and action plans that are assumed by the government.
What do you, as a man from the private sector, what do you see, where does the opportunity lie for a collaboration between the government and the private sector? And do you think that across Africa, because I know you're well-traveled, that is being seen, or can more be done to encourage it?
Yes, I think it's high time that the governments in Africa should know that there are different sectors that we've got to give to the private sector. In fact, agriculture. Today, the organization that I direct has the role of mobilizing and to engage the private sector in Africa into agriculture. Why? Well, it's so basic. It's very important because we should try to have a different understanding of agriculture. It is no longer just a small farm. In other words, in terms of developing agriculture, the state can, for instance, distribute just small tools and fertilizer, but that's not it. That's not the point. It's got to take big machines. It's got to transportation, banks, seed banks. It's different industries, different transactions. In other words, agriculture is a very complex development. And in Africa, we have a problem because we have always thought that then agriculture was going to be the source of everything. But in fact, it is the private sector that could really play this important role of developing a much larger scale of agriculture. And you're not going to see the governments investing in industry, in the big machines, and then taking over the financing for agriculture. It really is the private sector that has to do that. The first reason is that the private sector have a lot of money to put into agriculture, and agriculture needs money. The second reason is that they also have the knowledge. In other words, to be able to produce and to be able to transport and to transform and to sell.
Weigh in on what he's saying, if you can.
Absolutely. I think I want to pick up on that element of know-how. I think that a reference again to my experience in China is that one of the big differences I see is the enormous hunger for know-how. The investors were not so much desired for their capital, but they were desired for their know-how. I don't have yet the same sense in Africa. I think the private sector and investors are still too much seen as a source of capital rather than as a source of know-how. And let's be honest, in theory, Africa should benefit from the fact that Asia and Latin America have gone through the Green Revolution many years ago. There's actually not a lot of mystery in what needs to be done in doubling the yields in agriculture in Africa. There's no mystery in it. However, what is missing is the transfer mechanisms for getting that know-how in place on the ground.
How do you do it?
How you do it? First of all, I think there needs to be a cultural change. There are still too many African leaders and opinion leaders who do not accept the fact that Africa should steal with pride. They should copy with pride. And that means foreigners, expatriates, bring it in, bring it on. We are confident enough to take it on, just like the Chinese did. So there needs to be a sort of a slight cultural change, I think. Secondly, Africa needs to build a receiving end. So if you don't have research institutes, if you don't have educational infrastructure to spar with the private sector, of course then you are not going to fully benefit from that transfer. Thirdly, there is a minimum of infrastructure requirement that needs to be done. And I'm not only talking about power, I'm also talking about government steering and making sure that you have almost like clusters of development.
Let me hold that thought for a second. You're talking about infrastructure. You're introducing a completely different element because he says that agriculture spawns other developments, other things emerge from the development of agriculture. You're saying that you need infrastructure. Doesn't it, at what point do you, what is priority? Which one comes before the other? Is it the chicken or the egg?
A minimum of infrastructure. I said explicitly a minimum of infrastructure because I do agree that once that minimum is given, the private sector can play a very important role in building on it. And what is a minimum in terms of an educational infrastructure? But you need a minimum of reach. You have to get somewhere. You have to get to your facilities. But once that minimal infrastructure is there, I think we as private sector can build on it and expand on it.
Okay, Mr. Minister, I'm going to come to you. Okay, you want to say something before we go to the audience. In a moment, I'm going to ask the microphones to get ready so that we can get some questions from the audience.
Just deux observations.
I just wanted to make two observations here. First of all, the infrastructural policy concerning agriculture should not be envisaged in sort of an isolated way because the most of our countries are developing policies, infrastructural policies, and we have to somehow include those infrastructures for agriculture into the infrastructural plan in the different countries. In other words, irrigation or other infrastructure should not be a project that is isolated or separated in any way. And so if this, we need this synergy and we need this complementarity. And the second thing that I wanted to add is that the future of agricultural development, at least for a country like Gabon, is going to have to go through the involvement of young people. In other words, the political leaders are going to somehow attract those young people and get them involved, and that they should be interested in developing agriculture. But
Point, and I need you to speak a bit more on that very briefly, if you can, Mr. Minister. Young people still think that agriculture is not well, what's the decent word to say here? I'm not sure. But it's not a very attractive career path. You know, it's not something that they'd want to go to. They prefer to stay in the cities and do jobs that are blue collar. How do you transform that mindset? Because it's a key thing, is it not?
yes, in fact, the different political leaders, starting with the training of young people in agriculture, and also set up all the different accompaniment, for instance, financing that should be set up so that young people who are interested in agriculture should not be meeting problems when they want to initiate, for instance, a small business or a small agricultural project. And so we need the training, the classical training. Of course, in the classical training in the past has not been leading people into the agricultural sector. And so we have to somehow reorient that education in order to get them to go towards commercial agriculture or agribusiness and make it a real business and commercial and economic activity. And then, of course, set up the different mechanisms in order to accompany them and accompany their initiatives so that we can help them somehow.
Minister, any questions in the audience at all? Let me start with you, sir, if I can. Could we get a microphone to the front, please?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Don't you think that agriculture today should be an industry? Because fruits and vegetables, it's dying in all the countries of the world. Don't you think perhaps that agriculture needs to be mechanized? In other words, we should have research centers, research and development centers, and that agriculture should function in huge areas in order to produce sufficient food.
Thank you very much. We'll take another question from the audience to redeem some time. Yes, sir, at the middle, if you can. Yes.
Oui, retenons d'IA.
Yes, sir, it's an NDI. So, Gara, I have a question that is addressed to the minister. And of course, you could share the question. In other words, the Gabonese forest, you said, was the lungs for the world, and the Gabonese forest for the Gabonese population allows them to have food, to have a house to be developed because of the exploitation of wood, and also through tourism. So what is the equilibrium that we can somehow set up through the governmental policies in order to reply to those expectations which are contradictory because they're either agricultural development or forestry development?
Question, and we'll take another question from the audience to the panel. Any more questions at all? Yes, madam, in the middle, if you can, please.
Hello. Good morning. Bonjour. I'm Catherine Doulium de...
My name is Catherine from Bilio, and I have a question concerning Gabon, because we've noticed that almost all the different products that come for the population come from other countries. Everything is imported. And so I don't see any really concrete projects in terms of the industrialization and the agro-business that could somehow deal with the Green Gabon objectives and to somehow reduce the food cost for people in Gabon.
Mr. Minister, if you can, we have just a few minutes left.
Alors, je commencerai.
I would like to begin by answering the question of Mr. Ndiaye. because the law defines two different forestry domains, which are attached, first of all, to the exploitation of wood, and then, of course, you have the rural environment, which discusses the access of the rural populations to the forest. That's the first thing. And then the second thing I could say is that we are within the framework of the plan in terms of territorial management, so that when we're going to have the assigning of the different areas of the territory, when we're going to have huge areas for the plantations, we do not want the local populations to be pushed aside and that they're going to be disfavored by this process. So in terms of what exists already in terms of forestry exploitation, we have different laws in the code which will allow the local populations to carry out different forestry activities, whether they are in the small cuttings of selective cutting or small areas. But there's not a real fundamental contradiction in the management of the forest, because certain measures have been suspended, of course, with the concern of preserving the interest of the population, but also to avoid the forest to be the area of, for instance, illegal activity. And so, obviously, in a periodic way or in a continuous way, we have this process of reevaluating certain measures and to correct them, and then to be sure that nobody is pushed aside. So I think that is the objective today in terms of the reform that has been set up through the Forestry Code, and also in terms of the territorial management plan. And now the question concerning the cost of food products for the Gabonese people, because it all comes from other countries. A few years ago, the government took on some customs and fiscal measures that would somehow bring those prices down, especially of different basic commodities. And of course, Gabon is still a net importer of food products. And for that reason, of course, we've got to continue to make an effort in a more accelerated way so that we can insist on those agricultural development programs that we have already put on the list. But we can already say that we can catch up with the delay and to start some agro-industry projects wherein we can better manage the land that is being used, because we do have a planning for the use of the territory. Yesterday, we were actually talking about the implementation of the different policies, and I think we've got to insist on that to be sure that we can see how we can already set up what has been planned in the past, whether it's in the area of agro-industry or if it's in the area of different agricultural development models that already exist.
I'm going to give about a minute to the both of these gentlemen. Very briefly, if you can, in 30 seconds, what are the three things that Africa needs to do to transform agriculture, Mr. SECK?
The first transformation is the understanding of agriculture, and the second one is got to be a vehicle of transformation. We've got to understand it's not just the farm. It's got to be all the different segments of the value chain. And the third vehicle of transformation is that Africa is between between the north and the south. We've got all the different geographic zones, and we're divided exactly by the equator. So we can produce everything, and we can have 2 seasons during the year. And so, fourthly, we can mobilize the private sector in order to give them the information they need, the technology they can bring, the financing, and the markets. And I think the person who was talking was right. We've got to go toward the industrialization of agriculture because we're late. We've got a challenge today. And because the African population is going to be multiplied in 25 years. So if we industrialize agriculture, we're going to be able to borrow the different processes and the standards of industry that can be applied to agriculture.
30 seconds.
30 say it's okay. On the question on mechanization, absolutely. Agriculture must be seen as a know-how based and an innovation-driven activity. So indeed, it's about mechanization. It's about deploying biotechnology. It's about deploying nanotechnology. Absolutely, and it's missing in the debate. On the imports of foods, it's a scandal that Africa imports 40 to 50 billion of foods into Africa. And in almost all cases, it has to do with rent seekers. It has to do with protected interests that will not go away without strong political will to open the markets for normal market mechanisms.
Thank you very much. You know, I just stumbled upon a new statistic the other day, and it said that Africa would have a population of 2.3 billion people in 2050. And of those, there will be 1.4 billion young people. So the question is, if we don't do anything now, what sort of future are we handing these people? My name is Alan KASUJJA, and it's been a real pleasure. And thank you very much for being a part of this discussion. Let's give my panel a round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome TV anchor France 24,